Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koe eros, mina tangata o UnionAID I tā tātou manaakitanga. Tēnā koe e Eileen, I tau whakariti. Tēnā koutou e te whānau o Peter. Nā mihi nui a koutou. And kei Rutherford House, nā mihi I nā kautiaki o tēnei whare. Tēnā koutou katoa. We bit closer, is that better? So thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. My initial response on being asked to give something called a lecture is to curl up into the corner and think up excuses. But I did kind of snap out of that reasonably quickly because being invited to speak in the memory of Peter Conway is not to be taken lightly. It's a huge honour and privilege. I didn't know Peter well. I was a young Labour reporter in the early 90s when Peter was at the NDU, so we would have occasional, phone conversations, phone interviews, phoners. And sometimes when he was at the CTU, when he was there as a CTU economist, and we crossed paths again quite briefly in 2013 in the long shadow of Pike, of course, at that stage. So I really feel like I got to know Peter better posthumously when I was working on the Helen Kelly biography. And some of which, thanks to Liz, who pointed me to a lot of the important work that Peter had done. So not just reading through his economic bulletins, but research papers, book chapters that I might not have come across otherwise, and really talking to a lot of the people who knew him well and loved him. And of course, it was Peter who really drove the CTU's publication of a piece of work called Under Pressure, which is still, I think, the definitive exploration of precarious work in New Zealand. And it's spread into more and more sectors, and its role in punching holes in the statutory floor of wages and conditions for people who live by their labour. And it was a story that Peter was very passionate about, I know, and he wanted told. And that report, certainly in my mind, has lived on as an important piece, and it was very influential for me in a piece that I did about 18 months ago, a long piece I did in North and South, which I called simply Bad Jobs. We get to do that kind of thing in journalism, come up with snappy titles. And another really important piece of Peter's work, which I went back to over and over when I was working on Helen's biography and focusing on the 1990s, was his thesis on the impact of the Employment Contracts Act on the wages of supermarket workers. It told the story in clinical, meticulous detail of how the collapse of collective bargaining hit the pay and conditions of those workers, which of course was rapidly, severely, systematically and deliberately. So to Liz, who I know is online, Rosa, Sean and Maddie, to the wider whānau, to Peter's colleagues and all of those who he stood with, thank you for having me. So, hardship, hope, and why journalism matters. Why journalism, in fact, still matters. This is an in-joke between me and Eileen Brown. When Eileen asked me for a title for this talk so that the team could put out a flyer, I sent back Hardship, Hope, and Why Journalism Still Matters. And Eileen replied and asked, do I need the word still? This was the mark of a good sub-editor, hunting out redundancy and searching for economy. I replied, yes, please, I do. Please keep. I said, the still is a nod to hate and distrust towards the media. I was saying that that sentiment is strong, but that the craft remains and continues to be pursued with excellence and still matters. But I didn't do the reply all thing, and my reply didn't get to the person who was doing the flyer, and the title went out without the still. Anyway, it was fine because in my view, both are true. It matters, but also, despite everything, it still matters. There is a lot of despair about the state of the media. Complaints about shallow reporting, bias, beat-up salaciousness, and a smudgy and all too often absent line between reporting and opinion. Quite likely some of you here have jumped on your Facebook or Twitter feeds from time to time to rail against shabby media work or sensationalism or the absence of reporting at all on a worthy topic. And quite possibly you've jumped on your feeds and had a go at journalists in general. And I think when I started in journalism in 1988, journalists were among the people least trusted by the public. Generally, we were down in the bottom of the rankings alongside used car salespeople. So on one level, what's happening now is not new, but the surveys really are concerning. Trust in news is declining. In 2020, 53% of New Zealanders trusted news in general. In 2023, 42%. News avoidance is high in New Zealand compared with internationally. And this is these are figures from the Trust in News report from AUT's Research Centre for Journalism, Media and Democracy. 86% concerned about fake news, 94% concerned about poor journalism and about stories where facts are spun and twisted to push a particular agenda. People said things like news feels depressing and biased and it increases anxiety. It can be repetitive, boring and overly dramatic. I have spent 35 years working as a journalist and I can relate completely with many of the reasons that people cite for their loss of faith in our industry. I don't really remember what was exactly going on when I told Eileen that the word still mattered in the title, but quite likely I was doing something like shouting at my smartphone screen about stories describing the bottoming out of house prices, framed as if this is somehow a good thing and that falling prices are somehow a bad thing. Because, you know, there's always the question, for whom and whose interest is the narrative framed? But I do know that just a few days later, there was a story that blew up that spoke directly to my attachment to the word still. And you might recall the ruckus that went up about the equity adjuster score in the health sector. This was, I think, early last month from memory. So what happened here was a major news outlet promoted as a scoop that doctors were now told to prioritise the treatment of Māori and Pacific peoples ahead of others. The story led News Talk ZB and the Herald and hung around setting the news agenda that day and I think probably longer. It was presented as race-based healthcare. The story said Auckland surgeons are now required to consider a patient's ethnicity alongside other factors when deciding who should get an operation first. Continuing on, several surgeons, don't know how many or who they were, are upset by the policy, which was introduced in Auckland in February and gave priority to Māori and Pacific Island patients on the grounds that they have historically had unequal access to healthcare. One surgeon said he was disgusted by the new ranking system and that it's ethically challenging to treat anyone based on race. Now, the story did have some useful explanation and nuance further down, but the top slab of the story had done the heavy lifting. So soon people were calling in to express outrage at this racist apartheid system. There's a business model at work here, which I think of as a bit like a pyramid scheme. So Barry Soper and Jason Walls, the reporters who had the scoop, seeded the outrage. Mike Hosking then piled in with, quote, if you're a Māori, you get to the front of the queue. Kate Hawkesby, his wife, then has her own radio show. Surgeons, she says, are being dictated to about who got surgery first. Kerry Woodham piles in, adding for a laugh that she's going to run an ethnic quota of her call-in lines for Māori only. So hours of headlines blaring with shock and outrage. Aside from being inflammatory and misleading in its framing, the story was also not a scoop. The New Zealand Herald's outstanding health reporter had laid out the issue and the equity mechanism 2 years earlier. And a few hours after the original clickbait went up, that same reporter had written another sober and detailed piece explaining it all again, showing that it didn't put Māori and Pacific at the top of the queue and citing key data and research. I wasn't the only journalist shouting at my own industry while all this was going on. The best take on it was from a brilliant writer, Connie Buchanan at E Tangata, who called it, quote, piss-poor journalism, that it promised a shitload of clicks. We can do that kind of thing in journalism too, that you can't do in polite circles. She wrote, never mind that ethnicity is included in the equity adjuster tool because it's a proven independent factor in health outcomes. Never mind that health inequalities are based on ethnicity cost the health system over $860 million a year, and everyone agrees targeted action is needed. And on the matter of framing, she said there were 100 ways that story could have been written. For instance, new tool aims to address unequal surgery wait times for rural, poor, Māori and Pacific people. But no. And I'm going to read her analysis here because it is so bang on. She said, these guys knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to set the story up so it started out looking a bit like health news, but really was a lot more like politics. News stories, she said, don't just pre-exist somewhere out there, walking around intact and whole, waiting for an equal chance to step through the door of a media outlet and into the public domain. They exist in tiny bits and pieces among heaps of junk and distortions and agendas. And the bits are selected, assessed, ranked, and assembled according to the rigour and professionalism or whim and worldview of the journalists and outlets involved. Those reporters, she said, chose to construct a pretty ugly beast out of their scraps. The Herald chose to parade it. Then they stepped back and let everyone else feed on it until the whole thing became something big and real seeming enough to cause genuine uncertainty and fear. Never mind that lifting Māori and Pacific up won't push others down. Never mind all of that. They went ahead anyway and isolated ethnicity, used one or two anonymous voices to attack that aspect, and then piled up the article with on the back foot justifications from the health minister, Te Whatu Ora, and others. So why do I bother with this example in a talk about hardship and hope and why journalism matters still? The media industry has been in a state of constant, severe disruption for 2/3 of my career. The newspaper business model that I came into when I got my first reporting job in 1988 and when my J2 award wage was paid for largely out of the rivers of gold classified advertising in the back of the paper has gone. And as the internet became ubiquitous, the industry gave our complex, expensive to make product away for free. You all got used to it and you all came to expect it. A chunk of print advertising moved online, but it wasn't like for like. And according to a report for the Ministry of Culture and Heritage recently, news publishers have generated only $1 in digital advertising revenue for every $4 that they lost in print advertising since 2003. So the media industry has done what any business does when there's a revenue crunch. It got rid of workers. The number of journalists in New Zealand fell by 52% between 2000 and 2018. And job security remains a constant issue. Almost a quarter of journalists are concerned about losing their job in the next year, according to a Massey survey. And of course, meanwhile, Google and Facebook made money off our work without paying for it. And our industry had to turn around after all those years and try and convince you all that the news you've been getting for free all this time, you now needed to pay for. A few years ago, Paul Thompson at RNZ wrote that the news industry was at risk of becoming, quote, content tenants in our own lands. He said, pseudo-journalism, PR, spin doctoring, and all the more malign forms of propaganda that seek to co-opt the credibility of legitimate news is a constant threat. Well, he wrote that in 2018, which feels like some kind of an eternity ago. At that stage, I hadn't even heard of 8chan or Telegram. It was a year or so before a terrorist slaughtered 51 people at prayer in 2 mosques in my hometown, before COVID, before counter-spin media, and before the occupation at Parliament. I'm not any kind of expert on the media as an industry, and I'm not even across who owns what or what ructions are going on in this mahogany row or that. I'm simply talking from my perspective as someone who has worked in the print industry, in the print media for 3.5 decades while these tectonic changes have gone on. But I'm still here doing it. And Despite the savage loss of reporters from newsrooms, so are plenty of others who have been around as long or nearly as long as I have. When I think about those who have stuck with journalism, everyone has adapted and adjusted, but fundamentally continue to do their craft with the same sense of vocation and commitment as before. Think about skilled writers and innovators like Bernard Hickey with The Kaka, Patrick Smalley with Business Desk, Tim Murphy and Mark Jennings with Newsroom, Toby Manhire and Duncan Grieve with Spin-Off. Think about the absolute masters of the craft like John Campbell, Donna Chisholm, Paula Penfold, David Fisher, Matt Nippert, Tony Wall, Mike White, Guy Nespiner, and the brave, singular Nikki Hager. This is not an exhaustive list. There are more. They're all still doing it. The only reason to stay in this work is because you believe it matters. Every one of those people could have earned far more, avoided a ton of abuse, threats and contempt, and lived an easier life by applying their skill and intellects in other ways. And further, what I find even more heartening are the millennials who have come into this industry and are producing outstanding work. I came into an industry that had challenges, but was in some kind of steady-ish sort of a state. This next generation has come knowingly into an industry in a state of constant crisis, disruption and upheaval. And they have brought with them sharp minds, skill, technological savvy, and an absolutely visceral awareness of the hardship and chaos ahead in a warming world and the need for systematic change that offers hope to their generation and those after. So I think in the end, most of us who are still here working as journalists do it from an ethic of social justice and hold to the belief that by reporting stories of human tension, tragedy, resistance and creativity, by holding power to account, they contribute to a fairer, more cohesive and more informed and therefore more just and more tolerant community. I asked one of our bright younger stars, I know she won't want to be called young anymore, of New Zealand journalism while she's still in it. Kirsty Johnson was, I know, was in the middle of working on a huge piece on the failed attempt to get an agricultural emissions pricing scheme up when she texted me back. She said, and I'm quoting, "Now more than ever, I feel there's a real need for journalism that shows the public how the world really works, who holds power, what they do with it, what forces are acting to shape our society. These things aren't always within plain sight. Power thrives in secrecy and won't reveal itself without a struggle. That's why I keep going, because I want a society that's fair for everyone." And then she texted me back a couple of minutes later and said, "Did I think that sounded wanky?" I said, "No, I did not think that sounded wanky at all." Kirsty does this work in the face of trolling and abuse that is now commonplace. I asked her how she would describe the crap she's had for reporting, particularly on gender violence. She said, "Very bad and zero support." I also asked Oliver Lewis, who's another of the young bright stars. Like plenty of others, Ollie could have earned tens of thousands more by going into PR. But he said, quote, "Ferreting out critical information and sharing it with the public is hugely important because it challenges government and ministries to do better. Also, we have the opportunity to highlight people, organisations and companies that are trying to tackle our many wicked societal problems." So I know if you're a consumer of the media today, and journalists are consumers of media as much as you are consumers of media, it can feel like you're in a slurry of endless content. Ollie calls it journalism. But there are also stories at your fingertips, often still free, every day, that do exactly what I'm describing. I've written this talk mostly in the 24 hours since Kiri Allen's car crash and resignation. And I would say that with one notable exception that I saw, I would say this was pretty well reported. But like all the big stories these days, the sheer volume and rolling updates were overwhelming. But yet, even in that context of that wall-to-wall coverage, I dabbled for literally a few minutes on main news sites to show that there was also a swathe of other stories, well-researched, written with accuracy and integrity on matters of public importance. Ollie had a piece about efforts to find productivities and efficiencies in state house construction at Kainga. Nikki Mando had a story about profiteering oil and gas multinationals. Cecile Meyer had an investigation into the waste industry. David Williams continued an investigation into the impact of a high-speed yacht race on endangered dolphins. Mark Dolder and Olivia Winnan both made sense of the latest policy flip in the emissions trading scheme. Really detailed, policy-heavy, important matters of public importance. They weren't epic, ground-shifting investigations, all of them, just really good, everyday work that goes on routinely, contributing to the flow of ideas, to the depth of democracy, to the environment, to equity. So despite the industry being 2 decades deep in an ever-evolving state of disruption and crisis, despite the slurry of clickbait, excellent work by brave and dedicated journalists like these is produced on a daily basis. I want to talk a bit about the process of journalism, at least as I understand it. Alan Rusbridger, the longtime former editor of The Guardian, wrote a few years ago that there's no one thing called journalism, no single entity called news, no single recognisable identity for a journalist. That resonated for me. For me, and I think for a lot of others that I know, this work is a fairly solitary endeavour. You spend a lot of time on your own with the material, trying to figure out how to make it work and what you don't know. I'm also a generalist, not a subject expert. And most of us in New Zealand in reality are. We don't have the scale in New Zealand, particularly these days, to support deep subject experts. What that means is you are always a student. And I personally operate from a constant state of not knowing enough, constantly, furiously trying to fill yawning gaps so that I can tell a story that's as true and fair as I can make it. Always constantly grappling with massive doubt, commonly spending weeks or months feeling completely and utterly out of my depth. Every story also has its own story as to how it came about. And I've spent the last 6 or 8 months down deep on a 4-part series that's just been published in The Listener. And so I'm going to relate my comments from now on to that work because it is literally all I thought or dreamed about during that time. This is to give you an idea about how I go about things generally, including the kind of uncertainty and learning and network building and one thing leads to another chance that sits behind pretty much every story. So I called this series Hardship and Hope. And the project had an unusual genesis on one hand, but on the other was not unusual in the sense that it started out as one thing and ended up being another. Unusual in the sense that as a freelancer, I had some research funding from a philanthropist to approach a piece of work that would be about both the systematic taproot of poverty and the changes and actions that we could take collectively to build the opportunity for every child in New Zealand to thrive. It took me a long time to arrive at that kaupapa, and I was very strongly influenced by the parallel between climate reporting that I'd done over the years and what I was now seeing in the political and public conversation about child poverty. Both are existential crises, both require urgent action, as well as committed long-term strategic direction. Both are subject to various styles of denialism. In the climate sphere, the smart modern denialist doesn't say that climate change is a hoax anymore. They say, oh, it's too late, we just have to adapt, which is a get-out argument for those who don't want the trouble of re-engineering energy, food and transport systems or the inconvenience of having to reduce the opulence of their lifestyles. In the child poverty discourse, there's been an important shift. 12 years ago, there was barely any acknowledgement in the political sphere that it existed, and virtually no media reporting. But what was worrying me was that, although acknowledged and measured now, it's often bloodless, almost algorithmic. Have 65,000 kids really been lifted out of poverty? Is it BHC or AHC? before housing costs or after housing costs? What was the percentage point change in the number of children in households so poor that they don't have shoes or food? Incrementalism. And of course, the denialism. Oh, the parents just need to work harder, as if someone living in poverty is not by definition living under a crushing load of work and stress already. And simplistic statements like, it's all about education, that's the key thing. Or the parents should learn to grow a vegetable garden. And of course, the usual racist, judgmental bile that sits just below the surface across much of our public life in New Zealand. I think we have a broad ignorance in New Zealand about the deep taproots of poverty, its multifactorial causes, and the profound harms that it inflicts, particularly on children. It took me a really long time to figure out how I wanted to approach this topic, but I had this unusual benefit of funding that meant I could spend a good amount of time ruminating, reading and cogitating on what I could do that could be useful. So the process is not linear, it's messy. I read a lot, research papers, inquiry reports into poverty, the welfare system, cabinet papers, research by NGOs who work at the front line, books. I also engaged deeply in a process widely known by journalists, widely used by journalists, technically known as asking around. So I took a lot of advice. That means I had a lot of chats with people who work in the field, academics, researchers, activists. One key piece of advice I received and took to heart, and it really resonated with the work I'd done on climate change as well, was that there needed to be not just an exposition on the crisis, but there had to be spaces of hope. There had to be evidence that we could be better and that is available to us. The reporting and the writing challenge was then how, what spaces, who to choose, how to connect with people and ask them if I could come and hang out with them and talk to them for a week. And then how to hammer home the deep causal taproots at the same time as shining a light on the possibility and the hope, while not reducing that hope to a Pollyanna-ish, simplistic narrative. I had no idea how I was going to do that. But it just got to the point, and this pretty much always happens, where I just had to dive in. So I ended up with a plan of 4 distinct pieces, and each had to offer something different because, you know, journalism is designed to be read, not to sit in journals and libraries. It's designed to be interesting, to be stimulating, to be that thing, news. And with each piece, I had to build a contextual understanding of the circumstances of that place in order to bring the hope to life in the story. I had really absolutely no idea how this was going to go. But I did hold to the basic belief in the process of being a reporter, which is that if you go places and talk to people about what's happening for them with open ears and with respect, if you gather the background and write it into a narrative that will hold readers until the final full stop, so that they come away hopefully with a new insight or some information that they didn't have before, then what you've done is probably worthwhile. You wouldn't know it from the trolling and the slagging that we get as a profession, but this involves not only a massive amount of work, but it also relies on relationships of great trust. When I interview someone, I'm asking them to trust me to convey their words and meaning accurately, to not sit in judgment of them, or to approach things with pre-cooked conclusions. And the paradox that we have, I think, that with this apparent issue of falling trust in the media, and we know that trust is a foundational glue in society, and that is being frayed by extremism and polarization, by inequity, inequality, disinformation, and misinformation. But I find it literally mind-blowing how much trust people are prepared to extend to me, and I know to other journalists, because I can see that in the work that is produced. We still have this gift of trust in this country. Just a few examples I want to mention from this project, because they were meaningful for me and have moved me, really. Paediatricians at Hawke's Bay Hospital allowed me to be among them in their work, sitting through their handover meeting, they introducing me to their nurses, who allowed me to talk to them about their work while they went about it. 2 families allowed me to interview them about illnesses that their children were suffering from, which in both cases were entirely diseases of poverty and bad housing. Another one was I'd arranged to visit a man who'd been involved with rangatahi mental health for 20 years and who I also understood but didn't know much about it, was developing papakainga housing. It turned out that his cousin, who had spent years researching the history of the whenua on which this papakainga was being built, happened to be there, literally in the weeds at the end of a weed eater. There had been no pre-planning here. I was introduced to this man, Malcolm. He sat down on the grass, covered in flecks of grass, of weeds. An absolute stranger I was to him. And he told me about his ancestors, about the land, about the story of regaining agency over it. Another example, 3 women, 3 wahine, each with a huge amount of trauma and hardship in their lives, sat and talked without artifice about the hard stuff in their lives, in-work poverty, postnatal depression, their interactions with a punitive welfare system, grief, trauma, suicide. And they also talked about growth in their community action, in the innovation that they were involved with, in the learning that they had done, and the skill building that they had done. In general, you don't just turn up and have these interactions. Although in the case of that papakainga story, that's exactly what happened. The serendipity of that meeting gave me the confidence and drive to really dive into the history of the Native Land Court and to make that story one of the 4 of the series. But usually there's a period of relationship building first, establishing and articulating what I wanted to do, setting up any protocols to protect privacy when I'm talking to people who are vulnerable. I was asking a lot of people, and they were entitled to know that I was serious and that I had honest intent, that I was operating from a position of respect for the people I was talking to. And I'm well aware that there are some out there who might say that that just proves that I started out from a position of bias, just another woke journalist. Well, whatever. I don't think cynicism is useful. I think cynicism is lazy and dishonest. Skepticism, yes, skepticism is important. Evidence and analysis and data, of course. But over the years, I've allowed myself to bring more of who I am to this work. I come with a set of values like anybody else. I come with a sense of who I am as a Pākehā New Zealander, and I come increasingly with a strong sense of my own ignorance. I find that everything I learn gives me a slightly better idea of what I don't know. I'm constantly walking a tightrope between the need to learn history and the background, to accurately tell the story and meet deadline and stick to word length. On the papakainga story, here I was. I've got a good honours degree in history. I spent 35 years as a writer, and I'm grappling at this stage in my life to understand the basics of the Native Land Court, one of the most powerful and important institutions in the story of colonisation and in land alienation. I also try and be aware of what it means for someone to tell somebody like me, a Pākehā from Christchurch with financial security, about a life that has held trauma and hardship. Although even then, I sometimes underestimate it. One of the shorter stories in the series was about a woman in Cannons Creek, Ruth, who works with Wesley Community Action and is a leader in the community. She told me her life story, which included violence, homelessness, poverty, and isolation, and how through community action she'd recovered her health and control over her and her family's life. I went through the story with her on the phone before I filed it. And after it was published, I sent it to her. And then I worried when I didn't hear back from her for several days. Then I did. She told me that it had taken her days to muster the courage to open the story and read it. There's something confronting about seeing your own life in black and white. But she wrote, I felt the struggle all over again. Only this time the changes made and the support from Wesley has given me and my whānau a better outcome. Thank you for getting it right. I am very aware of my potential to do harm. And actually, the older I get and the longer I do this work, the heavier that responsibility feels. But I also do know that there is empowerment for many in telling their stories, knowing that in the process they are speaking for many. That's sometimes expressed to me with a level of gratitude that I don't really feel like I deserve. One person, one of these wahine who I recently interviewed, texted me afterwards and said, "Thank you for taking the time to listen to us." Wow, honestly, my privilege. When I was doing the postgraduate diploma of journalism in 1987, there were lots and lots of sessions around and discussions around objectivity and independence. I haven't abandoned that, but I think about it differently now. The thing is that we all have skin in the game. We all live here. We all have a stake in justice and equity and in a livable climate and in a healthy democracy. I have adult children and partners. I'm about to become a grandmother next month. I think that in 1987, when I was doing the postgrad diploma in journalism, I came away from that training with the idea that as journalists, we need to be kind of separate to conduct our work behind a hard boundary line. I probably went out into my first job with the idea of some kind of heroic objectivity, probably combined with an equally heroic, possibly silly notion of truth-telling. But when it comes to the existential crises that we face, we're all insiders. There is no boundary. And the process of reporting will never unearth something called the definitive truth. Our job is to be truthful, accurate and fair with the evidence, with the people who have told us their stories, with the complexity of the issues and with the things that we don't know. Reporting is always incomplete. There is no end point where you've nailed it. There's just the hope that you've added something to a collective process, that you've connected some critical dots, some human experience or evidence or insight to readers who might not otherwise have thought about that thing that way. And you never know if you've succeeded in that goal. You never know if you've made a difference. The point I want to make to you here tonight, really, I want to leave you with next time you're thinking of jumping on your feed to rail about the media or journalism, is that this craft is strong. It is innovative. It needs critiquing. It needs to be accountable. It needs to be honest about its mistakes, but it also needs to be supported. So if and when you feel inclined to have a go, please just try and emulate the way the very best of my peers work every day. Be accurate, be fair, be respectful, because we are all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca's kindly agreed to answer any questions, so now's your chance to put one to Rebecca. Who's going to be first? No questions? Yep. Glenn.
Hello, Glenn.
You were talking earlier about some journalists being quite deliberate in the decisions they made around stories. I'm just reflecting on the tax area and wondering, what comes first, because tax is an example where there's been a widespread understanding of tax as a burden and as a cost. And that's reflected in journalism and the kind of the moral panic whenever there's a talk about a new tax. To what extent is that journalists reflecting societal values? To what extent is it laziness on part of journalists? To what extent is it power and deliberate decisions being made by journalists?
Probably both. Some of these questions are often hard for me to answer, Glenn, because I don't work in the political beltway, and so tax is often an issue. I mean, I could pick up a tax story tomorrow, and tax is kind of like always on my list. At some time, somehow, you wait for your moment, but I don't operate within the sort of political reporting beltway, and I don't really know how those decisions are made. I think both. I think that there's, if I think back over the years, I remember doing a story on, a big listener story on capital gains tax in about 2013, maybe. And, it went to shit, it was probably the most interfered with story I ever did. And that wouldn't happen in the climate that we have around tax right now. I think that there is movement in the sort of the boundaries of opinion all the time. And so, I could pick up that same story now, write it in a similar way, and nobody would bat an eyelid. You could pick up a wealth tax story and run that. You could do a UBI story in a quite sort of clinical, analytical way, and it would be. I think there's a lot more flux now about what we need to be doing in tax, even if politically we're in a sort of stuck place. But yeah, it's hard for me to comment really on the way. I think a lot of the reporting around what's happened recently has been pretty good, actually. I think one of the things that's really different now is the proactive releasing of cabinet papers. So you get somebody who's like a full nerd like Thomas Coughlin, just, he seems to have this capacity to just sort of inhale documents and produce it by 3:00. It's phenomenal. I mean, he's another of these, young brains that's just, capable of chewing through evidence and data and producing stuff. I mean, I don't agree with everything he writes, but you've got to admire the capacity to sort of manage the material. So there's a lot more of that reporting, I think, now than we have had in the past. Don't know if that answers your question remotely.
There's another question.
Thank you very much. Well, no, thank you very much to you and I see Nikki Hager down there, all the great investigative journalists out there. I mean, it's just awesome the work you do. But we do seem to be in a situation where we often feel like we're in a losing battle, particularly as we may be on the threshold of a change of government. And I just wonder, what else should we be doing when we look at the structure of the media to actually make sure that the good guys end up winning, and so that's thinking beyond the work that you, the likes of you actually do.
Well, I guess, the easy part, I mean, I do see, friends of this room having a go on social media, and that's really why I sort of kind of put that into this talk tonight, really. It's cheap shots a lot of the time, and it's not helpful. It's bad enough coming from the nutter extreme without it coming from, learned academics, frankly, which happens. Yeah.
Wasn't you, Tony?
No, it wasn't you, actually. Somebody, one might accuse me of being oversensitive, but it's not helpful. It's difficult. If we are really in an industry where jobs are at risk all the time, and I mean, if probably half the room are unionists here, so that's your meat and drink. So we're in the thick of it. I think being available if you have expertise, be respectful of the process of journalism, don't expect to have everything in a story your way, understand the process that a journalism undertakes, understand the level of mental and intellectual workload that's involved in pulling a story together. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it has happened that, I'll have somebody who I've spent, I talk to a lot of people for a story. I'll talk to as many people as will talk to me if it helps me build my understanding join dots. And I try and make people understand that, this is not a trade here. You talking to me doesn't mean that you get some quotes in print, because it doesn't work like that. And sometimes people get pissed off with that. Well, leave your egos behind. We're just trying to do a job here. And if what we're told from an expert is excellent and important, but not quote-worthy, but helped, in my case, to build my knowledge and know that I need to read these other 5 papers in order to understand that thing, and in order to therefore write that one clause within that one paragraph, which is what happens, then that's what I'll do. So, don't be precious, share your knowledge, respect the process. I mean, think about who you're dealing with, but this is transparent. Our work is transparent, and, it gets published and it's open to critique instantly. Don't moan about stuff being behind a paywall, because somehow or other this industry has got to learn how to pay for itself. The complaining about the Stuff paywall, the complaining about the Herald paywall is ludicrous. You've all paid for news throughout your lives. It's unfortunate that we've spent 20 years giving it away, and now we're trying to sort of recover a kind of a business model. But, make your decision. Are you going to pay it or not? Don't complain about it.
Paul?
I think you're absolutely right, Rebecca. Someone who's represented journalist members of ITU since the mid-1990s, I think you're very right. I think we have a lot of people, as you have so rightly said, that are naive, who are cynical, and who like to continually attack the media, but in whose interest do they serve? Only those that continue to make fortunes out of the big platforms. And I think one of the things, and I can say this now that I'm no longer a full-time union official and involved in political parties as I have been all my life, but I think one of the things that I was most supportive of was the amalgamation of New Zealand for the APNZ, they called it, which was going to be the amalgamation of TV, NZ and Radio New Zealand, which would have been absolutely great. And unfortunately, a combination of political party, all these academics in journalism who united to destroy it, right? Because it wasn't their complete perfect model. And then they attacked Willie Jackson for his performance on a TV program. And I'll just end up...
Can you just bring this to a question?
I will bring it to a question. What do you think about journalists who, in a way, and I think the only negative thing, who do not sometimes understand Maoridom, and a lot of the attacks on Willie, that was made because he was of a more, what would say, everyday sort of approach. I think that's the only thing about the media sometimes is it's dealing with the matter of Maori and Maori presentation.
Well, I think we all have the progress that's been made within the last 10 years on that, Paul, I think is just phenomenal. The leadership of RNZ, not just RNZ, the work that staff has done, that's just, I think, spread, become normal. There's a huge way to go. And I mean, and I find as I was saying about the native land court, I mean, I find that, you hit these gigantic potholes of your own ignorance all the time, because we were not raised on our history. We were raised on a settler version of our history. So there's a massive amount of work to do. I mean, other professions call it cultural competence. I just call it being a human being. If I'm going to go to a marae and spend time talking with young Māori women, I have to think about, who am I? Who are they? I do things now like, thinking about, what I was saying about kind of not being precious behind this sort of boundary. Well, I'm a journalist and you're the interviewee. I mean, I do things now that I never would have done, which is I tell people who I am. I don't do a whole mihi if it's inappropriate, but I do say that I come from another place. I'm Pākehā. I live in a house. I live in a house that I own. I try and kind of bring who I am to the conversation. If I'm asking people to give me that, then I feel like they're entitled to know who the hell I am. And that's quite new. That's sort of in the last few years only, really. And it's quite, in some ways, I feel like it's it's come about not through a rational process. It's really just a kind of a part of the sort of, I suppose, the collective journey, I think, that we've all been on in the last several years, the resurgence of te reo, the much more widespread daily usage of te reo, the much more sort of active embracing of tikanga in public spaces. We're all growing with that. And that's how it's affected kind of my practice, if you like.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to thank you on behalf of UnionAID, and then Rosa's going to come forward and say a few words on behalf of the family. So just briefly, Rebecca, the word that came to mind listening to your lecture was integrity. And there's so much integrity in the process that you follow, the thoroughness, and just that sense of fairness and getting to the truth that is so evident in your work, and which these listener articles and and I think in particular the Pike River publication is such a testament to. So, and I think, that just brings back the memory of Peter, because integrity was the word that I would use for Peter as well. So it just brings another parallel between you and our dear friend. So, Rosa, would you like to come forward and say a few words? No, but Rosa's
Not sure where that is.
Yeah. Can I just introduce you, Rosa? This is Peter's daughter, youngest daughter, Rosa. And as we mentioned earlier, Sean, the brother, and Maddie are not able to be here. Neither is Liz, but I think they're all watching online, as is Linda, Peter's sister, who was caught up in snow back in Queenstown and wasn't able to get out today. So she would have wanted to be here as well. But we have Rosa, and it's great that you're able to join us, Rosa, for this really important occasion.
Thank you. Well, you've covered many of my acknowledgements. No reira, tēnā koutou katoa e mihi ana ki te atua, ki te hunga mate, ki te tangata whenua o te rohi nei, o Taranaki Whānui. E mihi hoki ana ki a koutou, e hui ana I roto I te kaupapa nei. No ingarangi me kotirano ku tupuna ko Rosa tōku ingoa. So first I'd like to thank UnionAID, to express our gratitude to you for continuing to uphold my father's legacy through your work, upholding his values. And I would also like to express our gratitude to you, Rebecca. Integrity was going to be my word. But your commitment to telling people's stories with integrity has really shone through in your talk tonight, and also to helping people understand who's telling the story and why. I was thinking of the writer and academic Donna Haraway's quote, all knowledge is situated and therefore partial, and that really came through, and it seems the way you do things. So thank you very much. Thank you.
No, I think
I've got Eileen.
yeah, thank you.
Anyway, so thank you for bringing Peter to us. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So thanks. So finally, just thank you for coming out on a cold night. Obviously, it was definitely worth it, wasn't it? Just a couple of things. Thank you all for the support you provide to UnionAID during the year, and the support I hope you will continue to provide. There is the opportunity to make some donations on the way out of the table. There's also coffee for sale. This is really good. I have to declare an interest here. It is my son's coffee roasting business, but I can vouch for it being good coffee. But the key thing is that we get $10 a bag for every 500 gram bag that we sell for UnionAID. So please buy some coffee. And we've got a new cookbook, UnionAID cookbook coming up, which I hope includes my old recipe that I stole from Matt Gaffrey. Gaffrey, yeah, the Indian curry. But it's quite a good cookbook. So it's coming out in a second edition, revised edition, which Sarah has prepared. So I think that's all. But I'd just like to thank Sarah and Eileen and everyone else, and Victoria University for providing the auditorium gratis. It hasn't always done that. It seems that when you get into a financial crisis, you can actually be more generous, which is great. So thank you, Victoria University.